Every year when I served as college chaplain, we had chapel several times a week, and I would ask students, there'd be cards that they would receive, and I would ask them, write some of your favorite songs that we can sing in chapel. And we had a variety of musical opportunities, a variety of styles of music, all that kind of thing. After all, it was college, there was a lot of good musicians around. And I was always surprised, in addition to the more contemporary songs, students, and this was admittedly 20 years ago, I was chaplain from 1993 to 2002, they would list Be Thou My Vision. I think some of it had to do with the fact that it's got a really cool Irish lilt to it. Makes it different. That along with Great Is Your Faithfulness. They were the two songs that young adults said were their favorites. Of course, that came from their home churches and things like that, but it just tells you that when something that's written 200 or more years ago speaks to the heart, it still has relevance. And that's a blessing to me. Well, last week we talked about faith and talked about the idea that faith, and this is my personal definition, that faith is when we trust in God and then therefore live in fidelity to that trust. We follow through. So therefore, faith often seems like more of a verb than a noun. I'm living faithfully. I'm acting faithfully. It's okay to invent words. Do it all. If Shakespeare can do it, why can't I, right? Today we're going to be talking a little bit about what makes living faithfully hard. Next week, we're going to be talking about what happens when people start really questioning their faith and start, if you will, deconstructing it. That's next week. So let's begin today by kind of visiting those three passages. The first passage that was read to us is a passage that comes from the Psalms, and it's kind of an interesting context. It puts the God Yahweh in a room with other people of power and authority, small g gods, and the great God judges them for not taking care of the marginalized, the weak, the powerless. God speaks out and essentially says, you think your power makes you better than. No, it makes you more responsible. And if you're thinking the way I am right now, it just popped in your head. Right now, if you're thinking the way I am, wait a minute, power, responsibility, that's Spider-Man. With great power comes great responsibility. Exactly. Did you know that Spider-Man preached the gospel? The second passage is from Hebrews. It's a continuation of the passage we read last week. This passage where we saw people of great faith. We particularly focused on Abraham, when by faith Abraham, when called to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Trusting God and acting in fidelity to it. Now there's a bunch of other people who are listed in that chapter in Hebrews, and then we came to this passage that Jim read. Therefore, And you all learned in junior high school or middle school that when you come across the word therefore, you have to ask, what is it there for? It's there to remind us that because of the faith of these folks, they've offered us a model for how we can live faithfully as well. And therefore, since you are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, I'm going to have to explain that. Okay. A friend of mine told me this story. His son was involved in marching band. Perhaps you've had somebody in your life who's been involved in marching band, and I will tell you from my many years of working with people in youth ministry that marching band is the curse of people who work in youth ministry. For a while, a sport will only take a season. Marching band lasts all year long, and it never lets up. It's crazy. My wife was involved in marching band, and I've looked at those pictures of her in that, uniform and said, if I'd known in high school. And so my friend went to this marching band competition. And as a parent, he was sitting up in the bleachers. And down on the field, there was a table. And the people sitting at the table were judges. And he said there's this really cool part in the competition where the marching bands are doing their thing, but they do, every band does this, where they're marching away from the grandstand. And they're marching away from the judges. And then they turn, and the music is really loud, and it's really great. And they start marching toward the grandstand, and marching toward the judges, and marching with all they can. They're playing their hearts out, and it's really exciting. And the crowd behind in the grandstand is cheering, and the judges are marking with their pencils. And sometimes we think God is like the judge. No, God's like the parent in the grandstand. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying about this great cloud of witnesses. The people who have gone before are not judging you, they are cheering you on. Last week I talked about the generation who built this church, and the generation that followed them, and the generation that followed them, and we come to you guys, and they are not in heaven judging you. They are cheering you on. They are not saying, how come you changed? How come you messed with my stuff? How come you're not doing it the way I did it? They're saying, you do your best, and you give it all. And let me tell you, son, daughter, it's more fun when you're good. So be good, and do well, and play that music best of your ability based upon the hours and hours and hours of practice. Right, Kristen? The hours and hours and hours of practice that you have to do to be good. And that's what it means by a great cloud of witnesses. That because of you have this great cloud of witnesses. We'll come back to that. And then we come to the gospel passage from the Gospel of Luke, and we're continuing to read in these passages in this section of Luke that follows after Jesus sets off resolutely for Jerusalem. He knows what's coming next. And we come to this passage that does not sound like the Jesus of grace and peace and the Jesus we love and the Jesus who tells us that just love everybody. Doesn't sound like that. This passage sounds like Jesus is an Old Testament prophet. And Jesus is saying, fire. Now, I've heard sermons where preachers will say that God wants to burn it all down. And that's not what this passage means. The fire Jesus is talking about is not a fire of burning and destroying, it's a fire of purifying. It's a fire of passion. And Jesus is saying, I wish you were as passionate about the things of God as I am. I wish that fire of passion and purification was happening right now. And then Jesus goes on and talks about division. And we get it. We understand division. We are living division right now. And people ask me, wait a minute, I thought Jesus came to bring peace to the world, and he's saying, I apologize because I spent 23 years on a college campus, just could not graduate. All my illustrations are from college. And I remember walking in to a class. Introductory, first year, freshman Bible class. And no matter what I said or taught, there was going to be division in that class. Might be 80 students sitting in front of me, and it was going to divide up really quick because I was going to say something different from what they learned in their home church. I was going to say something that might make them upset. Couldn't help it. It wasn't that I wanted division, it was division happened naturally because in college, we're trying to get them to think, so we are going to bring challenge into their life with enough support to help them get through, but challenge, they're going to have to question preconceived notions. And it's pretty, you don't have to say a lot to get people to freak out in college. Okay, if you think, take a bunch of 18-year-olds who've been raised in the church, doesn't matter what denomination, they've been raised in the church, and all I have to say is, you know, Jesus wasn't born on Christmas Day. Contrary to your Sunday school Christmas presentations, the Magi didn't show up at the manger. Simple things. I'm not bringing up hard stuff, I'm just bringing up simple stuff. Jesus was saying the natural consequence of this passion that he would bring into the world would separate people, and you know what that's like. It's strong enough that I remember my mom saying in the invitation that we would get as family to Thanksgiving dinner, there will be no discussion of politics or religion at Thanksgiving this year. Don't mess up Thanksgiving again. Yes, ma'am? Christians can't help it. For example, I got every single Christian denomination that has doctrines that they've written up about what they believe. Every single one around the world has a doctrine about sin. And these doctrines, these written statements about what they think about sin, basically divide into two groups. Half of the doctrines of sin really focus on individual sin. Individual people do and say. Now, some of them focus on sins that people commit that are what one theologian called willful transgression of known laws of God. In other words, you know what God wants you to do and you don't do it. You know what God doesn't want you to do and you do it anyway. And that was their definition of sin. Other groups talk about sin as being the Bible term is homomartia, which literally means an archer missing the mark. Anything less than perfection is sin. But that particular group, whether their definition is one or the other, they're focusing on individual sins, the sins that you commit. And that's where they're focusing. And they spend almost no time talking about the sins that are part of society, systemic evil, corporate sins, the sins in structure, and the things that cause people to be economic sins, cause people to be constantly in poverty and those kind of things, that kind of sin. They don't talk about that almost not at all. And then there are other churches that talk about sin being almost exclusively that. Corporate sins, systemic sins, evil in structures, things that cause these kind of societal problems. And they spend almost no time talking about individual sins. And trying getting people from these two groups together to solve problems is really hard. Because one group will say, well, we could just solve this problem if we deal with the evils of this economic system. And the other group says, well, we could just solve this problem if we could get people to find Jesus. And you can see there's not a whole lot of coming together with those two dynamics. There's conflict. But let me make this more personal for you. This is a quote from Greg Carey, who is a professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary. He said this a couple weeks ago. It's in the August issue of the Christian Century, which is a magazine that your pastor reads. Greg said this: "Our present conflict concerns not so much whether we accept or reject Jesus, but what kind of Jesus we follow. One brand of Christianity seeks to exercise dominion over all of society, claiming Jesus' authority for itself. Another version would emphasize the Jesus who blesses, heals, feeds, and uplifts all people. One movement denounces the sin of empathy, while the other tries to cultivate compassion for all. We face two powerful interpretations of Jesus that cannot be reconciled. And the church limps along with a fractured witness. In the end, we are called to live the gospel, which bears good news rather than self-righteous posturing. Dare we enter the fire Jesus stirs up and bear words and deeds of peace and love in the midst of this conflict?" That's what Jesus is talking about here. That's what makes living faithfully in the real world so hard. It's easy in church. It's hard out there. Therefore, since we were surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us run the race with endurance. Let us stay with it. Let's not give up. Let's figure out ways, practical ways, that we can live out our faith in the real world. Live out our faith at work. In just a few days, kids are going to be going back to school. I encourage you to pray for children and teenagers who are trying to live out a faith of love and grace when they may be taught that their faith means pointing a finger and rejecting. We are called not to give up. Those folks whose picture is in the room back there, the men's Bible class, that has more people in the men's Bible class than we have here, by a lot. They're not pointing their finger at you saying, "Where'd you mess up?" They're saying, "Keep going." Your challenge is hard, but you are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And God's got a passionate fire for